My parents called me a fraud, then a general saluted me at my Seal brother's wedding. The first person to salute me that morning wasn't a soldier I recognized. It was my own father, except it wasn't respect in his eyes. It was mockery. He looked at the dark blue suit I wore instead of a military uniform, laughed loud enough for half the church courtyard to hear, and said, still pretending to be somebody important, "Huh? Your brother actually earned his medals." Around us, wedding guests exchanged uncomfortable glances while photographers adjusted their cameras as if they hadn't just witnessed a family tearing itself apart before the ceremony had even begun. I smiled anyway. Years had taught me that arguing with my parents never changed anything. My younger brother, Ethan, was the decorated Navy SEAL. He was the hometown hero whose photographs covered the walls of the local VFW, whose interviews appeared in newspapers every Veterans Day, whose courage deserved every bit of recognition he received. I had never been jealous of him. Not once. I had attended every graduation, every deployment ceremony, every homecoming. I had stood in the crowd clapping louder than anyone else because I knew what sacrifice looked like. The problem wasn't Ethan. The problem was that my parents believed only one son could matter. In their eyes, I was the disappointment who left home after college, refused to explain what I did for work, missed birthdays, disappeared for months, and returned with stories that sounded intentionally vague. They called me a consultant. Then they called me a liar. Eventually they settled on a single word that became my family nickname whenever relatives gathered: fraud. "You probably print fake business cards too," my mother liked to joke. My uncles laughed. My cousins laughed. Even strangers sometimes joined in because nobody wanted to question the family narrative. I let them laugh because silence protected people I had sworn to protect. Every missed Christmas, every canceled vacation, every mysterious bruise, every sleepless night had a reason I could never reveal. My security clearance wasn't just paperwork. It was a promise. Breaking that promise could put lives at risk. So while Ethan became the visible American hero, I remained the invisible one. The irony was almost unbearable. Standing outside the stone church where my brother was about to marry the woman he loved, I watched relatives whisper as I approached. Aunt Linda leaned toward another guest. "He changes jobs every year." My cousin muttered, "Probably unemployed." Someone else added, "He only comes around when cameras are here." My father overheard and chuckled. "Don't encourage him. Next he'll tell everybody he's CIA." The group erupted with laughter. I almost laughed too because the truth was somehow even less believable. Before I could respond, Ethan appeared at the church entrance wearing his immaculate dress whites. The crowd immediately shifted toward him like flowers turning toward sunlight. He hugged me tightly before anyone could stop him. "You made it," he whispered. "I wasn't sure your schedule would allow it. Wouldn't miss your wedding." He looked into my eyes a second longer than usual. Ethan had always noticed things other people missed. "They're still doing it, aren't they?" he asked quietly. I shrugged. "It's your day. Let it go." His jaw tightened. "One day they're going to find out." "Maybe," I answered. "Maybe not." Before he could say another word, our mother called him away for photographs. As he walked toward the family portrait, the photographer pointed at me. "Brother, come on in." My father immediately raised a hand. Actually, let's do immediate family first. The words landed like a punch because everyone standing there knew exactly what he meant. I was immediate family. He simply didn't want me visible in the picture. Ethan started to protest, but I shook my head almost imperceptibly. This wasn't his battle today. He reluctantly turned back toward the camera while I stepped away and pretended to admire the church gardens. The shutter clicked over and over again, capturing a family portrait with one son carefully erased before history could remember he had ever been there. From the reception hall balcony overlooking the lake, I watched guests celebrate beneath white tents fluttering in the summer breeze while a marine band played soft jazz arrangements. Everything about the wedding reflected Ethan's life of honorable service. Military officers arrived from different branches, retired commanders greeted one another warmly, and veterans exchanged stories that stretched across decades. I stayed near the edge of the crowd, comfortable in the background. That was where I had lived most of my adult life. A little after lunch, my father walked onto the small stage to deliver his toast. He lifted his champagne glass toward Ethan with genuine pride. From the day he was born, he said, his voice cracking with emotion, we knew Ethan was destined for greatness. Discipline, honor, courage, he always represented the very best of this family. Applause echoed through the hall. I joined in sincerely. Then my father smiled again, except this time it carried the sharp edge I recognized too well. As for my older son, a few nervous laughs escaped from nearby tables. Well, every family has one dreamer. Some kids grow up wanting to be heroes. Others just enjoy pretending. The room went silent. My mother tried hiding her smile behind her wineglass. My aunt looked away. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether this was supposed to be funny. My father continued anyway. He always claimed he had important work. Funny how nobody's ever seen any proof. More scattered laughter followed, weaker this time. Ethan slowly stood from the head table. Dad. My father ignored him. It's all right. Maybe one day he'll surprise us all. The words stung far less than the expression on Ethan's face. He looked embarrassed, not for me, but for our parents. Before he could intervene, I calmly picked up my untouched glass and quietly slipped outside onto the terrace overlooking the water. The breeze cooled my face while distant laughter drifted from inside the reception hall. I pulled out my phone, intending to check a secure message that had arrived earlier, when an unfamiliar voice spoke behind me. Mr. Carter? I turned to find an elderly groundskeeper wearing faded work clothes. He handed me a small sealed envelope. A driver dropped this off 10 minutes ago. Said it was urgent. Said only you could open it. There was no return address. Only my name, handwritten in precise block letters I immediately recognized. My pulse slowed instead of quickening. Years of training taught me never to react before understanding the situation. I slipped the envelope into my inside pocket without opening it. When I looked back toward the reception hall, 2 black SUVs had quietly entered the property through the service entrance. No guests seemed to notice. I did. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the wedding resumed its joyful rhythm, but something invisible had changed. I noticed 2 men in dark suits speaking discreetly with local police officers near the parking area. They weren't wedding guests. They weren't security hired by the venue either. Their posture gave them away long before the tiny earpieces did. Federal. They scanned rooftops, tree lines, and entrances with practiced precision while pretending to admire the scenery. I deliberately stayed away from them. The fewer eyes on me, the better. Then Ethan found me standing near the lake. "Whatever's happening," he said quietly, "I know it has something to do with you." I gave him the same answer I had given him for years. "Focus on your wife." He frowned. "You're my brother." Exactly. Before either of us could continue, the distant sound of engines rolled across the property. Every conversation seemed to pause at once. Guests turned toward the long driveway where a convoy of military vehicles approached behind flashing escort motorcycles. The Marine band stopped playing mid-song. Local officers instinctively straightened their uniforms. Even the federal agents subtly repositioned themselves. My father looked confused. "Who in the world invited a 4-star general to Ethan's wedding?" someone whispered. A gleaming black staff car came to a halt only yards from where I stood. The rear door opened slowly. An elderly general stepped out wearing rows of ribbons that reflected the evening sun. Conversations died completely. My parents immediately assumed he had come to honor Ethan. My mother grabbed her phone to record the moment. My father proudly adjusted Ethan's jacket, smiling as if this unexpected arrival confirmed everything he had ever believed about his favorite son. The general surveyed the crowd only briefly before his eyes locked onto mine. His expression changed instantly. Without acknowledging anyone else, he began walking directly toward me. Then, just a few feet away, he stopped, stood perfectly straight, and raised his hand in a flawless military salute while every guest watched in stunned silence. Then he spoke 7 words that turned my entire family's world upside down. "Sir, we desperately need you back." The silence that followed felt louder than the Marine band had been all afternoon. Hundreds of eyes shifted from the general's raised salute to my face, searching for the punchline my father was certain had to be coming. Instead, there was only the crisp sound of the general lowering his hand and extending it toward me. "It's an honor to finally see you again, sir," he said, his voice steady enough for the front rows to hear. I accepted the handshake without hesitation, though every instinct told me this was happening far too publicly. "General, this isn't the place," I replied quietly. His expression remained respectful. "I apologize, but Washington believes it is." Behind him, 2 senior officers stood at attention without speaking. My father let out an awkward laugh. "Excuse me, General. I think you've mistaken my older son for someone else. My younger son is the Navy SEAL." The general slowly turned toward him, studying his face with polite confusion. "Commander Ethan Carter?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir." The general smiled warmly. "Outstanding officer. Your reputation is exceptional." Ethan thanked him, but before anyone could relax, the general added, "However, the man I came to see is your brother." A ripple swept through the crowd. My mother's smile vanished. My aunt's champagne glass trembled in her hand. Every relative who had laughed at me only an hour earlier suddenly looked as though the ground beneath them had shifted. My father frowned. "That can't be right." The general answered without raising his voice. It is exactly right. He reached into his briefcase, removed a slim leather folder bearing a classified seal, and held it against his chest without opening it. There are achievements inside this folder that will remain classified for many years. But I can tell you this much: if your family sleeps peacefully tonight, part of the reason is standing in front of you. Nobody laughed this time. Even the breeze seemed to stop moving through the trees. Before anyone could ask another question, a black SUV door opened again and 3 more officials stepped out. One wore the insignia of the Department of Defense. Another carried a federal credential clipped beneath his suit jacket. The third looked like an ordinary businessman until several CEOs seated at the reception suddenly stood in recognition. I knew every one of them. None of them should have been here. The businessman approached first. "Mr. Carter," he said, extending his hand, "the board is waiting for your decision. We delayed the acquisition because you requested 48 hours. My father blinked. "Acquisition?" The man nodded casually. "The cybersecurity merger. $8.4 billion. A stunned murmur spread through the reception hall. My cousin whispered, "Billion?" The executive continued as though discussing the weather. "Your signature determines whether the deal closes tomorrow morning." I answered without changing my expression. "That can wait until after the wedding." He smiled. "That's exactly what I expected you'd say." He stepped aside as the federal official moved forward. "Sir, Director Hayes asked me to personally deliver his regards. The Bureau appreciates your cooperation during last month's operation." My mother looked at Ethan as if waiting for him to explain what was happening. Ethan simply stared at me, slowly realizing the fragments of my mysterious absences, cancelled holidays, and unexplained injuries had never been random. "You worked with the Bureau?" he asked softly. I looked at my brother. "Sometimes." His eyes widened. "All those years?" I gave a small nod. Some missions required military coordination. Others didn't. The words were simple, but their weight settled over everyone listening. My father shook his head repeatedly. "No, impossible. He never even wore a uniform." The general answered him before I could. "Some of America's most important warriors never do." The reception that had begun as Ethan's celebration was becoming something no one had imagined. Cameras that had been pointed toward the bride and groom slowly turned toward me. Reporters hadn't been invited, but several guests were already recording everything with their phones. I quietly slipped mine into my pocket, wishing more than anything that the day could still belong entirely to my brother. I was about to ask the general to continue this conversation somewhere private when a young army captain hurried across the lawn carrying a secure satellite phone. He stopped beside the general but kept his eyes on me. "Sir, they've confirmed a second breach." The general's expression hardened immediately. "Location?" "Northern sector. 12 minutes ago." He handed the encrypted phone directly to me. "They said only you have final authorization." Every instinct I had spent decades sharpening came alive in an instant. I looked toward Ethan and then toward his new wife, who stood frozen beside the wedding cake, unable to understand why the happiest day of her life had suddenly become something else entirely. My brother walked over until we stood face to face. "Whatever this is," he said quietly, "go." If the country needs you, don't stay here because of me. For the first time all day, emotion cracked through my composure. I promised Mom I'd stay for your first dance. Ethan smiled sadly. You've been keeping bigger promises than that for a long time. I accepted the phone and listened in silence for nearly 30 seconds. No one could hear the voice on the other end, but everyone watched the color slowly drain from my face. When the call ended, I handed the device back to the captain and turned toward the general. How much time do we have? Less than 6 hours, he answered. And if you're not there? He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't have to. I looked once more at my parents. My father could barely meet my eyes anymore. My mother seemed ready to ask 1,000 questions she had spent years refusing to consider. Then, before I could take a single step toward the waiting convoy, another black helicopter thundered over the lake and began descending directly toward the wedding grounds, carrying someone whose arrival would expose an even bigger secret I had hidden from my family for nearly 20 years. The helicopter hadn't even touched the ground before every Secret Service agent on the property moved with practiced precision. Guests instinctively backed away from the landing zone as dust and flower petals spiraled through the air. The bride clutched Ethan's arm while children covered their ears against the deafening roar of the rotors. I remained exactly where I was. Running toward or away from an arriving aircraft was the fastest way to create panic, and panic was the one thing I couldn't allow. As the blades slowed, the cabin door opened and a silver-haired man in a tailored navy suit stepped onto the grass. He wasn't wearing a military uniform, yet every officer present straightened instinctively. Even the 4-star general gave him a respectful nod. The man scanned the crowd only long enough to locate me. Then he walked forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to making impossible decisions. "Daniel," he said, extending his hand, "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." I shook it firmly. "So do I, Mr. Secretary." My father's face turned pale. "Secretary?" he whispered. The man finally acknowledged the stunned wedding guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, forgive the interruption. I know today belongs to Commander Ethan Carter and his bride." He smiled warmly toward them before looking back at me. But sometimes the nation borrows its protectors without warning. My mother stared at me as though she were seeing a complete stranger. "Daniel," she whispered, "who are you?" I opened my mouth, but no answer came. Not because I didn't want to tell her. Because after 20 years of silence, I had no idea where to begin. Before I could speak, the secretary quietly said, "Mrs. Carter, your son has spent most of his adult life ensuring families like yours never have to know the dangers he faced." The words struck harder than any accusation ever had. Around us, relatives who had mocked me only hours earlier lowered their eyes. My aunt wiped away tears. My cousin, who had once called me a fraud in front of dozens of people, couldn't even look in my direction. Ethan finally stepped beside me and rested a hand on my shoulder. "I told you," he said softly to our parents. "I always knew there was more." The secretary motioned toward a quiet corner of the garden where the general, the federal officials, and I gathered around a portable encrypted display. A satellite image appeared across the screen, followed by several flashing markers stretching across the east coast. "The breach is larger than we believed," the secretary explained. "The network has activated earlier than expected." I studied the data in silence. How many cities? I asked. 7 confirmed. Possibly more. The general folded his arms. Every agency involved agrees on one thing. You're the only person who understands the full architecture of the operation. My father had wandered close enough to overhear. Operation, he repeated. The secretary glanced at him before answering. Your son didn't simply advise federal agencies. 15 years ago, he designed the joint intelligence framework that now connects military, FBI, Homeland Security, and private cyber defense during national emergencies. My father looked as though the air had been knocked from his lungs. No, that's impossible. He was barely 30. Exactly, the secretary replied. Which is why only a handful of people even knew his name. I remembered the sleepless nights, the classified meetings in windowless rooms, the funerals I attended under assumed identities, and the promises I made to widows who never learned what their husbands had truly accomplished. None of it had ever been about recognition. It had always been about keeping ordinary Americans safe without asking them to carry the burden of what almost happened. Ethan looked from the display back to me. All those times you disappeared. I nodded. I wasn't avoiding the family. His voice caught. You were protecting it. For the first time since we were children, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The understanding between brothers was finally complete. Then the secretary closed the display and lowered his voice. There's another reason we came personally. His expression turned unusually serious. Someone inside the operation betrayed us. Every off.